this is 9/11 Freefall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall. I'm the host, Andrew Steele. Tonight's guest is Stephen Dusterwald. He's a professional structural engineer with 37 years of experience in the field. And he's going to be talking tonight about, of course, the controlled demolition evidence as he sees it. And he's going to be talking to other engineers, talking about them, about the people who stay silent and how those people in his profession have a responsibility to speak out about the crime of the century. Of course, that is the cover-up of the evidence proving that buildings 1, 2, and 7 of the World Trade Center complex were brought down in controlled demolitions on 9/11. It's the centerpiece around which this show is focused, and we're going to keep on talking about it until we have justice in this country. So I'm going to be playing that for you in about 10 minutes or so. Before I do play the interview for tonight, I want to talk about some current events. And I do this sometimes when I feel that current events relate to our main issue, 9/11 truth, the science of the building destructions in New York. And at first it might not seem like it does relate, so I'm just going to ask you to just stick with me here. But we had the story break this week that Brian Williams, America's trusted anchor over there on NBC Nightly News, has been telling some fibs over the years, has been embellishing some stories, just making up outright lies to try to beef himself up, make his life seem more exciting. And it's sad. You know, I've known people like this. I've known people who just make up complete, utter nonsense. It becomes a way of life for them. They just can't do anything other than lie all of the time, even when they don't need to. Now, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not going to diagnose Mr. Brian Williams, but according to Breitbart, they claim, Breitbart.com, they claim 32 lies and disputed stories the NBC News let Brian Williams tell for a decade. That's the headline, and regardless of whether or not you like Breitbart, the fact is, this is what is going on. And Maureen Dowd at the New York Times, again, indeed claims NBC executives were warned at least a year ago that Brian Williams was constantly inflating his biography, that he was lying. They knew he was lying. And, you know, being in my position, doing what I do, being constantly an activist for 9/11 truth, I'm left just sitting here saying, well, of course they would know that he has pathological lying tendencies, because what kind of person would take a job giving people propaganda night after night and have no problem doing that? And again, when you start to see trends, and you can see that the news is trying to frame this as if this is just Brian Williams' problem, as if this is just one rotten apple and an otherwise noble batch of good apples out there giving you honest news. But let's just focus in on NBC for a moment here, because NBC does not necessarily have a good history with telling the truth. It's not just Brian Williams. And when you actually look at NBC's problems in the past, things that have come out about what they've done, it becomes a no-brainer. It becomes very obvious and sadly very unsurprising that their anchor is like this. He's climbing out of the same snake pit that other liars have. And I'm going to use just two examples because that's really all of the time I think I have here before I play the interview to go over. But we're going to start with this. Now, this is from a recent controversy. I say recent, it happened over the past couple of years. The Trayvon Martin case. Now, regardless how you feel about the whole Trayvon Martin case, I'm not bringing this up because I want to open up that wound on this show. This show is not about issues like that. But it is important to point out when journalists and news entities distort the facts, So I want you to listen to this. Now, this is the original 911 call that George Zimmerman made to the dispatchers when he first saw Trayvon Martin. I want you to listen to every word of this.
We've had some break-ins in my neighborhood, and there's a real suspicious guy. It's Retrieve Circle. The best address I can give you is 111 Retrieve Circle. This guy looks like he's up to no good, or he's on drugs or something. It's raining, and he's just walking around looking about. Okay, and this guy, is he white, black, or Hispanic? He looks black. Did you see what he was wearing? Yeah, a dark hoodie, like a gray hoodie, and either jeans or sweatpants and white tennis shoes.
All right, so he's describing that there's something suspicious about the guy, according to his own perceptions, as he's walking around, thinks he might be on drugs. The dispatcher asks him, what race is he, black, white, or Hispanic? And George Zimmerman says he looks black. All right? Well, when NBC plays this on one of their programs, this is the way that they edit it together. Listen.
This guy looks like he's up to no good. He looks black. Did you see what he was wearing? Yeah, a dark hoodie.
All right, so right there, they do a selective edit where they cut out the part where the dispatcher asks them what the race of the guy is, so they can make it seem like George Zimmerman is fixating on the fact that Trayvon Martin is black, okay? And again, I'm not bringing this up because I want to open up a debate about Trayvon Martin. I'm just pointing out that when NBC feels justified in lying, they will. They will distort the facts. They will edit something selectively to give you an image of something that isn't necessarily the case. And even if you think that George Zimmerman was wrong in this case, you should still be standing for the truth. I'm obviously a pro 9/11 truth, but if somebody came out with some kind of hoax video of Building 7 or made up some lies and presented it as the facts, and I found out about that, I'd be the first person coming out and saying that and condemning that person. All right? So this goes to show you that NBC is willing to do these kinds of things. But you can say, well, this was just one issue. Well, no, they've done this in other times, too. And again, like I said, I've only got really short amount of time to go over this. So I'm going to play this other clip for you. This is from, well, the actual incident took place in 1992. This clip, and the announcer I'm going to let explain the situation to you, is from a film. I'm not exactly sure what the film is. I got this off of YouTube. It's just a clip. So if somebody can tell me what film this is from, I'd be very happy. But listen to this story. I'll try to narrate it a little bit because you can't see some of the action taking place here on the radio.
Dateline NBC, a primetime news program, airs a story in 1992 entitled Waiting to Explode. The story includes footage demonstrating that a line of trucks produced by General Motors readily explode on impact.
To see for ourselves what might happen in a side impact crash, Dateline NBC hired the Institute for Safety Analysis to conduct crash demonstrations. Unlike GM tests, the fuel tanks were filled with real gasoline. Look what happened.
So the car crashes into the truck and there's a big fire. It's very terrifying looking, very horrifying. Oh my God, you're going to crash these cars and your car is going to catch on fire and it's just going to be horrible. This is what they're presenting to the public. This is what you see. Okay? But continue listening.
At impact, a small hole was punctured in the tank. According to our experts, the pressure of the collision and the crushing of the gas tank forced gasoline to spew from the gas cap. The fuel then erupted into flames when ignited by the impacting car's headlight.
After the program airs, one of the firemen at the taping of the crash contacts GM. The conversation inspires a full-scale investigation. 3 months later, NBC is forced to reveal their role in fabricating the news.
NBC's contractor did put incendiary devices under the trucks to ensure that there would be a fire if gasoline were released from the truck's gas tank.
We said the crash, quote, forced gasoline to spew from the fuel cap, end quote. GM says since the gas cap was the wrong cap for the GM filler tube, and because the gas tank was overfilled, the cap came off when the impact occurred.
We agree with GM that we should have told our viewers about these devices.
The Dateline reporter, however, said, quote, "At impact, a small hole was punctured in the tank," unquote. GM has now x-rayed that tank and found no hole.
We acknowledge the placing of the incendiary devices under the truck was a bad idea from start to finish.
That's our new policy, and we'll be right back.
All right, so their new policy back in the early 90s was not to lie, but apparently they continued lying for several years afterwards, and they continued lying through the biggest issue that we faced in our lifetime, which is the fact that buildings 1, 2, and 7 of the World Trade Center were brought down with explosives. They lie to you and say that there's nothing to that. And that's really why I'm bringing this up, okay? Because when Lester Holt, who is taking the chair now from Brian Williams, goes on the History Channel and hosts a program, a hit piece against 9/11 Truth, I want you to remember, if they ever show this on reruns, that he climbed out of the same snake pit that Brian Williams did. All right? That the people who edited that 911 call did. That the people who placed those incendiaries in the cars to try to fabricate a story, that's not even making a mistake. That's not even just incorrect reporting. That's just making up an entire scandal out of nothing. Creating a problem where it doesn't really exist for whatever reason. I don't even know what their agenda was with GM, or if they were just trying to create an exciting news story. But that's what these people do. That's the culture that they are coming out of. So when Lester Holt comes out and acts like the voice of authority, telling you not to listen to the experts at AE 9/11 Truth or anybody talking about 9/11 Truth issues, I want you to remember that. I want you to remember when Rachel Maddow is doing her pathetic hit attempt against 9/11 Truth and telling you there's nothing to this evidence without even really going into any evidence, just relying on the word of popular mechanics, which has already been debunked over and over again by writers at AE 9/11 Truth. I want you to remember that she climbed out of that same snake pit too. All right, NBC. But it's not just NBC. We're spotlighting NBC right now, but common sense should tell you that if you've got a problem in one place, there's a very good chance you have a problem in the other places too. And so NBC is not just on trial here. The entire corporate media is on trial. Because again, what kind of people will you find to read propaganda to the public? You're going to find liars. People who are happy doing it. People who do it unapologetically. All right? So this is it right here. And I've always called the other side the 9/11 lies movement. And these people punctuate that. They have a history of doing that. And that's why I'm playing these clips for you right now. All right, what we're going to do now is what we do every week. We're going to take 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and all the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. We're going to do that beginning now. And that is 10 seconds. Stephen Dusterwald is a licensed professional structural engineer with 37 years of experience in the field, including 25 years as owner and principal of his own structural engineering firm in Las Vegas, Nevada. He is focused on the design of nuclear power plants, large commercial buildings, and industrial buildings, and he's one of the signatories on AE 9/11 Truth's petition calling for a new investigation into the destruction of the Twin Towers in Building 7 on 9/11. He's also featured in the film 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. I'm very happy to have him here today. Stephen, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Great. Thanks for having me, Andy. Pleasure to be here.
Now, I breezed over your background. Please feel free to elaborate. Tell our audience a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I graduated with a bachelor's degree in civil engineering in 1973, and I worked for big companies, Bechtel, Morrison Knudsen, and other companies for about 12 years until I got my engineering licenses and then went into business for myself. So I got my civil engineering license in 1979 and my structural in 1982. And I've been self-employed since then. So it's not really a glamorous resume, but that's what I've done.
Well, what I'm impressed with is that you've had your civil engineering license for as long as I have been alive. I just turned 36 a few weeks ago. So you know what you're talking about. And certainly someone that should be listened to on the topic that we're going to be talking about today, the topic we've been talking about on this show since 2012. How did you wake up to the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence?
Well, you know, when I first saw the buildings collapsing, there was something way down inside that said to me, this can't be happening like this. This, the structural steel alloys that are used for buildings have specific characteristics that are designed into the alloy by the metallurgist. The metallurgist designs the alloy, and one of the primary characteristics is ductility. And ductility is the ability of the material to absorb energy through deformation without breaking or failing. And something that is not ductile has no ability to absorb energy. Like, for instance, glass is not ductile. Glass just shatters. Whereas steel, when you overload steel, it absorbs the energy by deforming, by stretching or compressing or whatever, but the crystal structure of the material is made up so that it can deform large amounts, absorb large amounts of energy before it reaches the ultimate strength where it breaks. And so when I was watching the buildings coming down, they were coming down like they were made out of glass. And it just went against everything I knew from engineering mechanics that a steel building would come down in a more it would be a slower process. And essentially, the way they came down, it means that the structure that was designed to hold those buildings up, and it's held it up for the 20 years or whatever it's been there, provided no resistance at all to the collapses. And that goes against the laws of physics. You know, the sum of all the forces on an object is equal to the mass times the resultant acceleration. So if the acceleration is equal to acceleration due to gravity, that means that there's no resistance from the structure. So you have all these huge steel columns and members and everything, and they're not providing any resistance. So that's what kind of set an alarm off in my head. And I went around the internet, and it was probably 2005, 2006 when I first ran into these videos, you know, Zeitgeist and Loose Change and like that. And then I finally heard about the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and I went to that website, and everything they said made sense to me, and so I signed up. I guess it must have been 2006 or 2007 or so.
Now, what you said about the crushing of the building resembling glass, that's a very good way of putting that. I never even thought of that before. I never heard it referred to before. But you attack this from an angle that I don't hear very often in terms of how the steel is meant to absorb the energy. And typically, when you talk to your average layman, your average person out there on the street who, by default, wants to believe the official story, they're going to say things like, well, yeah, the Twin Towers, they maybe shouldn't have collapsed that way, but they were hit by an airplane. You know, what do you expect to happen? You know, people throw this out there. So I know you kind of went over it just now, but what would you say to somebody, as advice to audience members who may hear someone say this? What would be the simplest way for them to refute that argument?
Well, essentially, an airplane is made as light as possible. Essentially, it's a shell. And it's not meant to take forces from solid objects. It's meant to take aerodynamic forces from the air. And so consequently, it's got a very thin shell, and everything is made as light as possible. And when you see that plane crash into the building, it's like the plane is going through a cheese grater. I mean, the plane is made out of this lightweight shell, and then it's hitting these tremendous steel columns. And you can see when the plane impacts and it goes into the building, the corner column where it impacted isn't even damaged. It's the thing is, the structure is so much more beefy than the airplane. The airplane, it's like an aluminum foil model going into a screen, if you will, or a bar screen, something with members, say, a foot apart. It's basically like a screen, and the airplane it's just going through it, being ripped to pieces as it goes past all those big beefy steel members holding the building up. So basically, you can tell people that a plane only weighs 200 tons, and those buildings were designed to be impacted by, in fact, two planes, as I understand it. And essentially, all the fuel, when that huge ball of flame, that was all the fuel in the plane burned up instantly in open air. So, I mean, there wasn't like pools of jet fuel laying around. I mean, it all burned up on impact. So essentially, again, getting to the ductility of the buildings, you can see that, like I say, when you have a controlled test in engineering school, they put a sample material, a piece of material, and then they stretch it, and you can see it beginning to stretch, and then it necks down at the point where it's going to fail. It gets thinner, and then it finally breaks. But it absorbs a tremendous amount of energy, and it deforms, it stretches, maybe 30%, 40%, 50% of the original length, and then it'll get what's called strain hardening, where the material hardens up and the slip planes lock together, and that's when it breaks. But all that takes time for that material to absorb that energy, and that energy has to be constantly supplied to keep the deformation increasing. So just basically the ductility, if everybody can just remember that word, ductility, is a big arrow to point at these people that don't want to believe, who want to believe the official story. In fact, there was during World War II, when they were making the ships to send to England and everything, they didn't know much about the ductility and so on, and they made alloys that would get very brittle at low temperatures. And in the North Atlantic, the water temperature would be below what's called the nil ductility temperature, and ships would actually break in half just like they were made out of glass. They had no ductility. They were using alloys that nobody had bothered to look into the ductility of these materials, and they had a lot of failures. And that led to people doing research and metallurgists designing new alloys that didn't have this problem of no ductility. So by the time we get to the building of the World Trade Center, metallurgists have had this figured out for decades now about how to control the amount of ductility in the alloy. And the structural steels used for buildings have a high ductility, and that's why they could not fail at the speed that they did on 9/11.
What's funny, while you were talking, I called up this article, and anybody who listens to this show regularly may remember that I've read this on the program before. But right from the day of 9/11, this is the London Telegraph. It says, Twin Towers built to withstand plane crash. And in this article, they're scrambling, trying to figure out an explanation for what they saw. But the very last paragraph of this article says, sightseers at the towers over the past few years would have seen a reassuring information panel at the top floor visitor center explaining how they should not worry about plane crashes as the building was made to withstand them. So right there, it shows that this was not a surprising development. This wasn't something that they didn't take into consideration right from the beginning. I mean, they decided to make an information panel explaining this to the people. Something kind of curious, though, as I'm reading this. Like I said, this seems to me almost to be the media's attempt to come up with an explanation for what they saw that day, trying to fit it within the box of the official story, because really nobody was thinking to question this, with the exception of maybe 3 people on the internet at the time. But it says here, the twin... hold on. Oh, but the immense steel columns in the core and around the perimeter supporting the enormous buildings were not enough to prevent them slipping down into a rising fog of dust and debris which engulfed the streets around the city's financial district. And then they interview Alistair Sohn, who's a consulting engineer, is from England, and he says, but this was, of course, a completely abnormal situation and one which would not have been envisioned by the people who built it. The strength of the towers was enormous, but they would not have been designed for aircraft strikes, which actually gets debunked later in this. But what do you think about those sentiments being expressed here?
Well, I mean, the engineers that designed it said it was designed for airplane impacts. And here's the thing to remember. The buildings are not only designed for gravity loads, things going down, but they also have to resist wind and earthquake. And these are called lateral loads. So the building code requires that the building be designed not only for the vertical gravity loads, but also for the lateral wind and seismic loads. So these buildings are designed for, I think, 120 mile an hour wind on the full area of the buildings. Now, they're 1,100 feet tall and 200 feet wide. The area, a sail area for wind, is just gigantic. And, 120 mile an hour wind, basically the wind on the building is equivalent to probably 20 or 30 airplane impacts. The area, like I say, for wind would produce. I haven't run the numbers, but you can see for 120 mile an hour wind blowing on something 1,100 feet tall by 200 feet wide, it's in the hundreds of thousands of pounds, and the aircraft, I believe, weighs 200 tons, which, like I say, compared to the wind and I'm not sure about the seismic factors for New York, what those are, but just the wind alone would be much greater than even 2 airplanes impacting the building. So, just the natural forces that the building has to withstand, the forces of nature, were much greater than imposed by the plane crashing into the building.
Now, and just because I mentioned this article, so I'm going to bring up one more point. I'm just going to ask you to address it. Professor Sohn, who was an acquaintance of engineer Leslie Robertson, who constructed the tower, said, these were very advanced designs for their time. There was a very large amount of space between the central core and the outer perimeter of the buildings, which allowed a lot of office space. Is that significant?
No, really, because the fact that the outside shell was actually part of the lateral load resisting system is very important. In other words, they weren't counting on the core to resist everything. They used the exterior of the building as a stressed shell, and that's what all those long vertical members were. They formed like a grid, like a screen, if you will. And a closed section, that is like a rectangle, or actually is a square. Those buildings were square, and when you have a closed section, like a closed tube, it is very resistant to twisting and bending and, deformation, axial and bending and so on. Now, when you have an open section, suppose the building was shaped like a C, like a top, you have a leg going across horizontally and then one coming down vertically and then another one, shaped like a C or an L. Those structures, because they don't have a continuity around the entire perimeter, those are much weaker in resistance to loads. So the fact that the buildings had an exterior shell, which was part of the resisting system, helped it. In other words, it was at the maximum distance from the centroid where the core was. The shell was at the maximum distance, and so consequently, it was the most efficient use of the material is by putting it as far from the centroid as possible. That makes it just like when you make a column and you have, say, a 6-inch pipe. Well, obviously, if you make it a 12-inch pipe, it's going to be a lot stronger because the material is further from the centroid of the pipe. So you can see as you make the diameter bigger, the shell, the external shell, does more and more work more efficiently than something that's small and in the center.
Just starting off from a completely neutral standpoint and accepting the official story for what it is, drinking that Kool-Aid for just a moment, this would still represent a tremendous failure of government, a complete government screw-up. Our employees, people working for us, the president, working for the people, failed that day. And so they need to be as transparent as possible. So considering this and the complete failure of our government to protect us that day, it seems that everything should be laid bare for the people to see. However, it hasn't been. All right, NIST and missing a free fall happened only after one of our guys, David Chandler, publicly embarrassed them with a question at their technical briefing, and then they try to obscure it in the report. And now we have NIST. Years later, we had NIST refusing to release the data in their computer models, saying it. And go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that if you see their animation of the way that they proposed that Building 7 collapsed, it doesn't look anything like the video of the building coming down. It's like here they put forward this mathematical model of how they're going to explain how Building 7 came down, and the animation doesn't match the video of the building. I mean, they're shooting themselves in the foot right out in the public square. They're saying, well, here's how it came down, and it doesn't look anything like the video of the building coming down. So, I don't know how they keep a straight face.
Well, I've compared it before to a guy who buys a teddy bear for his girlfriend while he's away on vacation, and then he can't carry it on the airplane, so he's got to stuff it in the suitcase, but it won't fit, so he just keeps on trying to jump on it and beat it, and he cuts an arm off, cuts an ear off, and by the end it doesn't even resemble the teddy bear anymore. When you start off with a preset conclusion, this box that you have to fit the explanation into, they're going to do some real mental and scientific gymnastics to make this happen. And if I were to speculate, I would think that maybe they don't want to release this information because they don't want people to see that for themselves. You have the fact that they left out parts of the building, left out key features of Building 7's design in order to reach their conclusion. I mean, we have absolute fraud. I mean, what is your take on the secretive nature of NIST? I know you're not a lawyer, but just as an engineer, I don't think any you or your colleagues would have the guts to act the way that NIST has in this case. How close to fraud would you consider this?
Well, I would consider it to be lying, right? Just bald-faced lying. I mean, they're trying. They have an agenda. They are given this story that whoever is in charge wants this official story to be the one that's out there that explains it. And so, like you say, they're doing the same thing like the guy with the teddy bear. They're cutting off pieces or whatever, anything to make it fit into this preconceived narrative that they're trying to support. So they're starting with the conclusion and then trying to make the evidence fit. Instead of the scientific method where you examine the evidence and then come to a conclusion, they're going about it the opposite way. They're starting out with a conclusion that has been the manufactured official story of how the thing came down, and then they're trying to make the evidence fit the conclusion. So it's, I'm still amazed when I meet an engineer, and I try to start talking about this stuff, and they just will refuse to even listen to it. Because they know in their hearts, they know that the official story isn't true, but they have a plausible deniability that they're not crazy, they're not a conspiracy, so they just walk away. They refuse to even discuss it with me. They don't try to, support the official story. They don't try to attack the story put forward by AE 9/11 Truth. They just walk away. And why would somebody be so afraid to talk about it unless they were, in their hearts, they knew that they didn't have a solid stance? They don't have a leg to stand on. So, like I say, it's just, I've read some psychologists' reports about cognitive dissonance, that people, even presented with visual evidence of something, will not believe it because it challenges their worldview of their construct of the universe and how things work. And that this physical evidence put forward by AE 9/11 Truth is the thing that makes them question their own beliefs about the universe. And so that's a big step for them to take, and they don't want to take that step.
You know what I wonder, too? Again, I don't try to get into people's heads, but I do sometimes, speculate based on my own psychology, I guess, and just experiences I've had and people I've encountered. I almost compare it to a police officer who's off duty, happens to be somewhere, I don't know, some donut shop or something, and he's maybe even unarmed at that moment because he's off duty, and a guy comes in, and he's much bigger, over 6 feet, 300 pounds, and he's carrying a knife, and he's robbing the place. And it's the cop's duty to do something. He's a police officer. He probably may still have the badge on him, but does he really want to deal with this situation? He's probably going to get stabbed if he's a smaller guy. So what are you going to do? And so I look at the overall architects and engineers, going into a profession like that, especially probably around the time that you were entering, you probably didn't think you would be stepping into a profession that would be associated with any controversy. You probably didn't. I can safely assume most architects and engineers didn't foresee a situation like this taking place in which they would have to make a stand for the integrity of their profession and do the right moral thing, even though it's hard, because it's science. It shouldn't be political. But now here they are in this situation, and when you wake up to this, you've got to do something about it. And I just feel that maybe just people don't want to have to do something about it. They don't want to even be in this position. That's why they walk away. That's why they run when you bring this up. I don't know. What do you think?
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right, is that they realize that it is a really big challenge to their whole belief system, and it's like more work and more grief questioning their belief systems than they want to do. They would rather stay in that, whatever you call it, the dreamlike state of the like in Vanilla Sky with Tom Cruise, they have that lucid dream where, they just feed data into your brain, pleasant circumstances and everything. And basically, people want that. They want everything to be quiet and calm and no controversy. And when the government comes out with a report, they're just so happy that the government has something out that they can just lean against and not question. Oh yeah, this is from the top. This can't be questioned. And then so they don't have to question it. And then when the evidence from AE 9/11 Truth comes out, we're following the evidence, and this is physical and scientific evidence that can't be refuted with debate. I mean, the facts are what they are, and the physical events occurred as they did, and so you have to follow the evidence and then come to the conclusion. And that's they don't want to do that work. They don't want to challenge their own beliefs, their core beliefs about the nature of government and, the world construct and how conflicts are resolved and so on and so forth. So, but I agree with you. They don't want to get into all the work that it would take for them to question their beliefs.
What do you think this does to the profession, though? When you have the integrity challenged, I always mention in 1984 how they always try to get the main character to say 2 + 2 = 5 instead of 4, because the government wants to assert that it controls reality. And in this case, you have the engineering profession being told that 2 + 2 = 5, and a large part of them are being expected to accept that. And so, what do you think this does to the future of your profession?
Well, I think that it's really, it's just one of those things that, I talked to Richard Gage about this, and, he said that somebody asked him on one of his interviews, you say, well, all you have is 2,300 engineers, but the government has this explanation, and you're just 2,300 engineers, and there's hundreds of thousands of engineers, so how come they aren't joining? And I told Richard, I say, well, the government story is being made up by about 10 engineers. I don't see any organizations out there, architects and engineers, for the official story. I don't see any organization like that out there. So obviously, all the engineers that are sitting on their hands about this issue are not jumping up and supporting the government story. And we have 2,300 architects and engineers who are questioning the conclusions made up by like about 10 or 12 or 15 engineers in charge at NIST. So we have much more engineers and architects and evidence than the government does. So basically, we have 2,300 people that are saying that this official story can't be true. And we have on the other side the 15 guys in charge at NIST who framed the official story and are putting it out there. But I don't see any volunteer organizations of private engineers, calling themselves architects and engineers for the official story of 9/11. So, there's no coherence in the engineering community to either support or deny the official story. So, obviously, if they were really dedicated and really believed the official story, they would form an organization to counter the opinions of AE 9/11 Truth. And there aren't any out there because they know that AE 9/11 Truth is true.
That is a good point, and one I have not even thought of. One of my friends made this comment when we were talking about this stuff, and he said if there were 2,300 doctors that came out and said that Jiffy Pop will kill you if you eat it, the media would go into a hysterical fit. It would be on the news probably before they even checked the veracity of the report. All right, and it's a silly example, but it goes to show you that that if there's no political agenda attached to something, 2,300 professionals on a certain topic who know what they're talking about is enough to get attention on something, but not on this. Not on this because there's a political agenda attached to it.
Right, and that's the thing is you say all the engineers and architects in AE 9/11 Truth, they don't have any motive to do this except to tell the truth. They're not making any money off of it. They're putting their reputations in jeopardy because all the other engineers that are sitting on their hands and not saying a word about it are, calling them kooks or whatever. So, the people in AE 9/11 Truth, they have nothing to gain except to tell the truth. So, like you say, when there's a political agenda, people will lie. But when the only purpose is to get at the actual physical evidence and the actual truth of the event, that's people will step forward and place themselves in jeopardy in order for the truth to be out there. As far as anybody impugning the motives of the architects and engineers in AE 9/11 Truth, they don't have a leg to stand on. What are we getting out of it except the satisfaction of knowing that we're telling the truth?
Yes, and I'm curious, what would you say if you're talking to up-and-coming engineering students? I actually talked to one, and I helped him with his, I'm not an engineer myself, but he wanted to talk to somebody from AE 9/11 Truth and get some statements, and this kid was writing it for his senior report. And he's going to be an engineer, and he's going to get his degree, and he's going to sign the petition, and that's great. But what about those guys who are going to be up for graduation next year coming into this world? Given the silence of the engineers, many of them are regarding this that you described, what kind of sentiments would you express to these new up-and-coming people in your profession?
I would say be the professionals that you are trained to be and use the scientific method where you follow the evidence to a conclusion. Like, that's the scientific method. Is somebody has a problem, you identify the problem, then you create a hypothesis about how this problem could have arisen. Then you do tests or you gather evidence to see if the evidence corroborates your hypothesis. If it doesn't, you have to go back to the beginning and get a new hypothesis and follow the whole process. But what engineers can do is just do what they've been trained to do, is use the scientific method of following the evidence to support your hypothesis until all the evidence is in support of your hypothesis. Then you can say that your theory or hypothesis has been proved. So Richard does that in Blueprint for Truth, one of the videos from AE 9/11 Truth. He has the whole scientific method laid out, and how these buildings, according to the official story, they don't follow the scientific method. When you take the hypothesis of AE 9/11 Truth, every fact fits into place in the scientific method. The evidence supports the hypothesis. So that's what I would tell the new engineers, is be true to your profession and tell the truth no matter where it leads. And examine the physical evidence before you make any conclusions, is to investigate the evidence, look at the evidence, look at the hypothesis, and see if the evidence corroborates the hypothesis. And follow that trail of truth wherever it leads you, even if it's going to make trouble for you in your personal life, because this is the responsibility that we've taken on by being engineers. We're basically dedicated to the public safety. All the building codes, and all the ethics rules for engineers are always, you have to protect the public safety. And only by revealing the truth about events and using the actual evidence gathered can we arrive at that truth. And that truth is the reason for the engineering profession to safeguard the public safety. So that's what I would tell new engineers: be true to your profession, tell the truth, and follow the truth wherever it takes you.
That's a really good point. And it's not something, at least me personally, I don't think about first when I think about engineers in terms of their public responsibility. Obviously I'm aware of it, but I don't think of it in the same terms as I would like a doctor or a police officer. But they do. Essentially, when you're designing something, some piece of equipment, or these big tall buildings, you are given a tremendous trust by the people who are going into your buildings. And so you have that same responsibility that a doctor or a police officer would have. And the first thing you learn in at least being a doctor is do no harm. And I think the silence is harm. You don't sit on your hands if you see that somebody has a cancer developing and not tell them about it.
Right, exactly. That's that point you made is perfect, because that's really the engineers who aren't saying anything. They're denying their responsibility to participate in this discussion about what's true. And like I say, they're reneging on their professional responsibilities to protect the public safety by keeping quiet. They're denying their responsibility as engineers. And like I say, that's basically what engineering is about. Is structural engineering is to design structures that will safeguard the public safety, that aren't going to fall down, that if things fail, they'll fail in a predictable manner that gives sufficient warning. All these provisions in the code that use this ductility of the steel, it is to give occupants of the structure visible evidence that the structure is in distress. When you start hearing things creaking and you see beams bending and twisting and whatever, while those members are absorbing all that energy, they're making groaning sounds, and plaster is breaking off the walls and the ceilings. So that's the design philosophy that is meant when you put ductility into the materials, is to give people a chance to get out of the structure. Once it starts getting overloaded, things start to deflect and are visible. And the sounds that these materials make when they stretch and bend and so on gives people at least 5 minutes to get out of the building, more like 10 minutes or probably. But, for the buildings to come down in 11 seconds, that doesn't give anybody any time to get anywhere. So so we can see that there are mechanisms at work on 9/11 that are not part of the natural process of failure of ductile steel alloys.
Right, and of course the top part would be decelerating too. Even if you want to believe Nist's explanation, there'd have to be some kind of slowdown of this top block while it's somehow committing suicide on the way down, because you never see the top block sitting on top of the big rubble pile in any of the pictures.
Right, and the thing is, the stuff on top is the lightest part of the building. When you design a building, they're built from the ground up, but they're designed from the top down. You start with the roof, and then whatever load the roof imposes on the floor below it, you add that load to that floor's load, and then the floors, as you go down the building, the members get bigger and bigger. So how does a small, lightweight superstructure at the top crush a part of the building that is stronger than the part that's coming down? It doesn't make any sense. It's another one of those fantasies that anybody just say it and hope for the best. Oh, it's being crushed from above, but no, the top is the lightest part, and the members get bigger and bigger till when you're at the bottom of the building, all the members are holding everything above it. So it's 1,100 feet of building being supported on the members at the bottom. So of course they're huge. So that just blows the whole thing about the descending piston theory. It blows it right out the window, because a lighter, smaller thing can't crush a bigger, heavier one.
Right. Now, I think about this, and I don't know if it's just I'm starting to get older and it's just the fate of everybody to think that society is getting worse as you get older because it changes. Because, sometimes I read things from the past and I read about things and it just seems like, well, no, people have always been sort of the same at all times. Attitudes about certain things change, but deep down people at their core have the same kinds of fears, insecurities, violent angers, and all the same stuff that we suffer from now in modern day. So I want to know from you, again, you've been a civil engineer licensed for as long as I've been alive. Do you think the silence from the engineering community on an issue like this would have happened decades ago? If 9/11 had happened in 1979, do you think that we would have been facing the same situation?
I think we would, because what we have is people in power want a certain scenario, like, have a good reason to go invade Iraq. And even in, I forget what year it was, 1997, 1998 or whatever, the Project for a New American Century, which was Cheney and Rumsfeld and these other guys, they said that the United States needs global hegemony, which means we're like the dictator of the world. They say, absent a Pearl Harbor type event, we don't see how the United States can assert its world hegemony. So they said we need a Pearl Harbor type event, an attack a devastating attack on some part of the United States that has tremendous cultural significance in order to get everybody riled up enough for us to go to foreign wars that we would have no other reason for going there. And I think it was the same thing with the Spanish-American War. Hearst, you know, he printed in the papers the blowing up of the Maine or whatever. I mean, you know, he made that up. The explosion was a boiler, overheated and exploded. But in the newspapers, he said that it was fired from a Spanish ship or whatever, and that's what started the Spanish-American War. You know, the one that's in 1901 with Teddy Roosevelt. I don't know if I got the right name for it, but yeah, I mean, you have people that have a vested interest, arms manufacturers and, you know, military-industrial complex that have a reason. They make money off of wars. And so there is always this pressure to be going to war. And it's almost exclusively the executive branch. I mean, even the Founding Fathers said that wars are most likely to be started by the executive branch, you know, like a monarch. When the kings in England and Europe always were having wars because they wanted to go to war. The people didn't want to go to war, and that's the truth. Even the head of Nazi propaganda, Goebbels, said that none of the people in England or Germany or United States or France want to go to war, but people don't control the country. The leaders control the country, and they're the ones who can get the whole country to go to war. You just accuse an enemy on the outside of some dangerous enemy is coming to attack us, and we have to preemptively make war on this country or whatever to prevent that. And that's how they get people to go to war. And this is the Nazi propaganda minister. So he admits it, that the people in Germany and England and the United States don't want to go to war. But the leaders are the ones who make the policy, and they want war, so there's war. So I think that, I don't think that when this occurred would have a big difference. The people that would be pushing for it have always been around, and they'll always be around.
That's right, and listening to you speak, I mean, I know about these things, I'm reminded of that, I'm reading stuff about other events in last century that took place, and I think it would have been harder. If this was 1979, if I was sitting here with feathered hair and bell-bottoms, trying to figure out how to get the word out, I think it would have been a lot more difficult because we did not have the internet, we did not have user-created content, the ability to reach people like we do now. I may have been, again, sitting here in 70s clothes trying to talk to people on shortwave and maybe getting out to a couple, but Stephen Dusterwald, I want to thank you for coming on 9/11 Freefall.
It's been my pleasure, Andy, and thanks for doing all the hard work you do.
This program's on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also download MP3s of this show from the Internet Archive by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.